Yesterday, I presented evidence from the American Monthly Magazine, 1830-1831, Volume 2, which showed that Albert Pike was plagiarizing the poetry, the classroom assignments, and private poetry of Abby Poyen when she was 14 and attending his class in Newburyport, Massachusetts. Now, the last thing I showed was a poem called The Curse that was in the Philadelphia album, and it was in the May, I forget which edition it was in May. And right there on the image that I'm showing on the screen, it says it was reprinted. Excuse me, I just jumped on the camera real quick and threw this shirt on. It says that it was reprinted from American Monthly Magazine. I didn't even notice it. So I don't think Pike was ever submitting to Philadelphia Album. I think either Abby or Mathew was submitting them for her, or she was submitting them herself, but I don't think that was one of the publications that Pike was ever publishing in. So this morning, somewhat reluctantly, I decided to do due diligence and go forward in time and look in Volume 3 of the American Monthly Magazine. Now, I've given all this history before in earlier blogs. I couldn't find which one it was, but near as I can tell, Albert Pike got romantically, probably sexually involved with one of the girls at the house that he was staying at, where they were putting him up as a teacher. And I think it was going to be a shotgun wedding, and he was expected to marry the girl. And as soon as it got warm enough, that was the winter, and as soon as it got warm enough in 1831, he bugged out. He literally footed it out west. He got to Tennessee, which we'll see, and then eventually he ended up in Arkansas. That's not why he says he left. He gave the girl's name, Elizabeth Perkins. He says that he secretly fell in love with her, but he was too poor he was too ashamed of his poverty to ask her to marry him. That's not what happened. He bugged out so he wouldn't have to marry her. I'm sure Mathew tells a couple stories about that, and I've shared all of that before. But anyway, he left in March, and then apparently he was first in Tennessee, and he continued to submit to American Monthly from Tennessee, which we know because he says in italics where he is, Tennessee, at the bottom of these submissions. But there's one more from Abby, and that's in the April edition. So let's go to that first. Now, I have said that he was cut off as of August because apparently Abby and Mathew found out what he was doing, see? And she stopped leaving her workbook in her cubbyhole or whatever they had. But apparently, I'm guessing that there was one class assignment, and he copied that over and published that one after he left town. I mean, she couldn't do anything about it then. He was gone already. And he apparently copied this one over. So he didn't have any more of her personal poetry, but he was able to send in as his own one of her class assignments. And this is a poem to Ariel. Now, Ariel is an angel, which I had a real hard time finding out any information about who exactly Ariel is supposed to be. She's kind of a nebulous character. So you can look that up yourself and decide which definition you want. We don't know for sure what definition Abby would have gone by. I do know she was a mystic, that she was studying the occult, mystical sources. And to her, based on the poem, I would say she considered Ariel an angel that presided over nature. So now all of this is going to be on my Kindle. I don't have any physical sources. So let me find this one. O thou most quaint and delicate spirit of all, shapen by that old sweet and kingly mind that sate enthroned on heights ethereal of strange romance, and now has grown enshrined within men's brain, thou that wast born to close the eyes of pearly lily and red rose and jessamine and poppy and all flowers at time of sleep, with thy slight wand oblivious, thou that makest winds come creeping out from bowers where they have warmed their wings of morning hours, folding them in the sunlight plenteous upon small beech leaves. 'Tis thy task to wake the winged odors from the crimson buds and rainbow blooms, and the spring roses make open their lips and send sweet spirit forth, inspiring the young bees. Well, that's Abby. You can pretty much tell her style by this time, I think. So Pike managed to steal one more. He copied it over when she turned it in as a class assignment, and he kept it. That's all that is. So then, after that, we've got in the May edition is The Curse. That's where that first appeared. We've read that last time. It's awful. Then there's one called The Penance. Now, you'd think that writing about the penance, then, well, that kind of exonerates, Albert Pike, that he feels some remorse. Well, sociopaths feel no remorse. And the thing is that they use the pretense of remorse to talk about horrible things. It's exactly what Charles Dickens did in his sensationalized stories about the lower classes and the ghettos and so on in London. His supposed philanthropy and charity was an excuse to write sensationally about these things. And we know that because of the scene that he got obsessed with reenacting toward the end of Bill Sikes murdering Nancy. He practiced that privately and in public, and he got so obsessed with it and got so into it that it threatened his health and possibly killed him at the end. So you can see where he was coming from. But Pike, I think, does the same thing. A spirit lived in a blossoming flower under an orange tree. Through all the fits of the changing year, most joyfully lived he. No winter ever came to whiten the leaves of the flower in which he dwelt, no shriveling rays that the sun shot down through the boughs of the trees it felt. But when it faded of gray old age, and the fireflies left its leaves, and the humbird carried those leaves away to make her nest in the eaves, before the stalk fell down to the earth, another grew in its place, and the orange flowers threw down their dew till it came to its parent's grace. And it quivered its lips and shook for mirth as it grew, and its parent fell into the earth. He dwelt in this flower and sunned his wings in the small gleams through the cone of the orange tree, and frequently the leaves of the flower bent down and formed a veil to make more pale his face, that grew red and brown. His office was to feed the dreams that hid in the orange tree, clinging beneath the silent leaves, where the sun could never see, for he doth delight to scorch their wings till they die in misery. So, I mean, this is a guy that he really delights in torture, in scorching somebody's wings till they die in misery, but he has to figure out a way to bring this stuff in. See, Abby wouldn't have written about that. And then he goes back to a gentle voice and so on, and an elfin home. And he says, a spirit came once to this elfin's home, an inferior soul was he, and he thrust him away with a laugh and scorn and cruel tyranny, till he wet his wings in the cold night dew, and through his soul the night winds blew. See, that's the kind of stuff he likes. He gets off on that, but he has to find a way to get to it that's acceptable. So I don't know if you agree with me or not. I mean, obviously I'm trying to make a theory, but that's the way that strikes me, that I can tell Pike's work because he just has to work around to something cruel, he just can't resist it. So then we have Wandering to the West, and that's a travelogue from Tennessee, and it sounds quite innocuous, it's pretty good. There's a couple little clues in there. He meets a very pretty girl that he falls in love with, but he just doesn't dare. They exchange rings and stuff, and and he doesn't see her again for a long time later, and then she's got another boyfriend. But there's something rather odd about the way he puts it. So he says, to cut the matter short, we did stop at the place. I won't shock your nerves by writing that name again. And here I spent 2 or 3 days very pleasantly. I rambled about with the fair Ellen, read to her, talked with her, and felt a certain indefinite feeling about the brain, which an older head than mine might have defined. And to say the Christian truth at once, he's no Christian, some things chanced, the remembrance of which makes me feel exceedingly like a fool, exchanging rings, for example, and something about coming back in a year or so, I hardly know, and a lock of hair. In short, I was a fool and in Elysium. What had I to do with love? He sees her with her new boyfriend and shakes hands with her and her lover, and he ends up by saying he might have retained her. I think she loved me best, and hang me if, when I go back, she is not married. If I don't marry her, my fit of generosity in giving her up out of the struggle has kept me awake many a night since. Well, a sociopath can fall in lust. There's no question about it. But when he does, he's damned if he's going to admit that there's any love involved. He just, I don't know. I mean, you can read it a couple different ways, and it's intended to be read a couple different ways. But there's something a little cold about it. I'd say that Ellen was very fortunate in not marrying him. she got lucky. This is my personal opinion. Now, there's another installment to that I won't go into. Let's see. We have another installment of the Penance, which I won't go into. Then there's a poem to the Merrimack. All of these are written from Tennessee, with the exception of Abby's poem and The Curse. There's no place given for them. But after that, as of June, he's writing from Tennessee. And the poem to the Merrimack is actually pretty decent. I don't think we can say that this is Abby's poem. It sounds like his poem, missing Newburyport, because he was brought up in Newburyport. It's probably his, and it seems pretty much sincere. So, usually no sooner do I find 10 pieces of evidence that point in the favor of my theory than I find one that points in the wrong direction. And I admit that. In my books, I show the contraindications and so on. So I'll read a little bit of this in fairness. I want to keep this kind of short. Basically, if you haven't seen the previous entry, I recommend you see that one first. This one won't make much sense. It's just an addendum. Adieu to thee, broad-fronted, noble river. I leave thee, yet thou shalt be absent never, but thou shalt be to me a constant dream, a portion of my spirit, beautiful stream. It's not very good poetry, but at least I think it's sincere. And in a nook of memory ever kept, be thought of alway. When a boy I wept to see thee falling to the near blue sea, forever present, ever leaving me with shadows of great ships upon thy brow, moving like living spirits on thy flow. For even then I thought of death and change. I have been with thee at mid-noon range, when thou hadst throned the high sun in thy heart, and lapsed above his image constantly. Then in a small skiff, kept apart, in a brief solitude from men and things, and while thy airs were like the skylark's wings, that fan men with cold breaths from mountains taken. Then I have lain and slept and dreamed, and wakened through all the long and summer afternoon, and listened to thy water's gentle tune around the slight keel of my graceful bark, until at time of the approaching dark I might return at peace with all mankind. It's not bad. It's not the quality of poetry that Abby was producing, but it's not too bad, and it's not mean, so that's nice. But if that was basically the quality of poetry that he had been submitting all along to the American Monthly Magazine, I doubt he would have been published very much, because it's okay, in my opinion. I don't know how anybody else feels who knows poetry. I'd say it's okay. I don't think it's great poetry. It's not really deep poetry. He likes the river, and he went out in a little boat on it, and he had a little solitude, a little alone time, and felt peaceful when he got back, and he's put that in thou and thee and so on. Then there's one written on the night of the last of March. Let me see if I can find that one. This is almost certainly Albert Pike, unless he stole it from somebody else. I don't think Abby's the only person he ever stole from. This is fairly decent, but again, kind of get the tenor of it, get the consciousness that's in it. Away, away, thou parent of fierce winds and tempests, rolling in cold, cloudy masses, which thou, like some great speckled snake that winds about the fern, gray piles of rocks that binds, and in and out the grass of the morasses, nursest within thy breast, teaching them to dart forth with fiery tongues amid the hail and sleet that thou hast woven for thy veil, to hide thee where thou writest in the blue. And so they feed forever on thy heart, till thou dost faint away before the swart and leafy shades of April. It's pretty violent, That is not the poet that wrote to Ariel, It's not the poet that wrote to Summer. It's just a totally different person, obviously. And he's pretty good. He's learned to be fairly decent as a poet because he now has decided that he's a poet, you know. It's not bad, but like I said, it's pretty violent, and it certainly doesn't evince the deep spirituality and the femininity and the ethereal quality that and that depth of insight that Abby has in her poetry. So I think that having done due diligence and looked forward into the next volume of American Monthly Magazine, I basically have proved that Albert Pike was plagiarizing Abby Poyen's poetry when she was a 14-year-old girl in his class, and that when she got wise to it and started taking her workbook home, that he was able to plagiarize at least one more of her class assignments before he left town hurriedly. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention. I did find an asterisk sign poem right directly beneath one of these Wandering to the West travelogues. There was an earlier asterisk signed poem of Matthew's. These are all Mathew, in the September 1830 edition, and that was an unrequited love poem, apparently to his previous love, not Abby, but the girl he'd had a terrible crush on for several years. I won't go in and read that one. But this appears in the June 1831 edition. And I had said that I didn't think that Mathew read this journal, but nonetheless, apparently on rare occasions he would submit to it. So apparently Mathew has put aside his goose quill and he has purchased a silver pen, but he finds that he gets writer's block just as easily with a silver pen as he does with a goose quill, and that's what this humorous poem is about. It says, "My gray goose quill no more shall stain this hand with deeper blots than if it had forever lain with those among the pots." It's in quotes. "A gayer plume young beauty brings, a pen she bids me hold, fresh dropped as from the silver wings seen by the seer of old." So these are like puns and references. "With Walton's British best, I fill the channel deep and wide," that must be an ink, good brand of ink, "and leave it at its own sweet will in liquid laps to glide. I strive o'er hot pressed bath to roll triumphantly along the tide that overflows the soul with melody and song. But vain the strife from hour to hour, alas that it is so, that silver pens have not the power to yield the silver flow, that not the page with golden pail nor costliest implements, as Swift has long since sung, avail to make song or sense." And there's the asterisk. Now, you'd think that maybe that was just an asterisk to a comment, but there's no comment underneath it, so that apparently is the signature. That's Mathew joking about the fact that he's bought a silver pen, but it's not helping him. Now, he did have trouble writing poetry. I don't think Mathew really thought of himself as a poet. He wrote some excellent poems, but he didn't think of himself as a poet, and he had writer's block, I think, when it came to poetry. I have the same problem today. I could write prose all day long. I could sit here and write a blog entry 1,000,000 pages long, all day without a thought, like breathing. But poetry is another matter, and I think it was that way for Mathew. So all of this information from Volume 3 is pretty much consistent. We see a little bit of Mathew appearing. We see one of Abby's poems that Pike stole, apparently a class assignment that he took with him out to Tennessee and, or wherever he was, and submitted it to American Monthly Magazine. And we see a bunch of his stuff. And most of it is trying to be poetic and trying to be in the old style, but there's violent tinges in it. He lapses into being violent and cruel, and he excuses it various ways as though he's in penance or, whatever, or as though it's a villain, like Charles Dickens did, but he just enjoys that. And you don't see any of that in Abby Poyen's poetry. So there's the difference. I stand on what I said before. Albert Pike was plagiarizing Abby Poyen Whittier's poetry, and his best work that he's credited with that made him famous was actually Abby's and not his.